Hi, guys. Thank you so much for responding to the Survey Monkey about whether you wanted me to read a story. I'm really honored that you guys love that so much that you wanted to make that part of your routine. So the winner of the votes was Voyage of the Dawn Treader. That's going to be the next book. It is book 3 in the Chronicles of Narnia. Now, if you remember, at the end of book 2, Prince Caspian, there were 4 children, right? Peter, Susan, Edmund, Lucy. And Peter and Susan, the 2 oldest ones, had been told by Aslan that they wouldn't be coming back, but that Edmund and Lucy would be. They had established Prince Caspian, and that's where this book picks up. The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Now, this does have, the Dawn Treader is a, is a boat, is a ship. So this is going to be a journey with lots of little adventures in it. Chapter 1, The Picture in the Bedroom. There was a boy called Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it. His parents called him Eustace Clarence, and his schoolmates called him Scrub. I can't tell you how his friends spoke to him, of course, because he had none. He didn't call his father and mother, but Harold and Alberta. They were very up-to-date and advanced people. They were vegetarians, non-smokers, teetotalers, and wore a special kind of underclothes. In their house, there was very little furniture and very few clothes on the beds, and the windows were always open. Eustace Clarence liked animals, especially beetles, if they were dead and pinned onto a card. He liked books if they were books of information and had pictures of grain elevators or of fat foreign children doing exercises in model schools. Eustace Clarence disliked his cousins, the 4 Pevensies, Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy, but he was quite glad when he heard that Edmund and Lucy were coming to stay, for deep down inside he liked bossing and bullying. And though he was a puny little person who couldn't have stood up even to Lucy, let alone Edmund, in a fight, he knew that there were dozens of ways to give people a bad time if you're on your own at home and there are only visitors. Edmund and Lucy did not at all want to come to stay with Uncle Harold and Aunt Alberta, but it really couldn't be helped. Father had gotten a job lecturing in America for 16 weeks and that summer, and Mother had to go with him because she hadn't had a real holiday for 10 years. Peter was working very hard for an exam, and he was to spend the holidays being coached by old Professor Kirk, in whose house the 4 children had had wonderful adventures long ago in the war years. If he had still been in that house, he would have had them all stay, but he had somehow become poor since the old days and was living in a small cottage with only 1 bedroom to spare. It would have cost too much money to take all the other 3 to America, so Susan had gone. Grown-ups thought her the pretty one of the family, and she was no good at schoolwork, although otherwise very old for her age. And Mother said she would get far more out of a trip to America than the youngsters. Edmund and Lucy tried not to grudge Susan her luck, but it was dreadful having to spend summer holidays with their aunt. "It's far worse for me," said Edmund, "because you'll at least have a room of your own. I shall have to share a bedroom with that record stinker, Eustace." I'm going to grab a drink of water. Just wait. My allergies are still giving me some trouble. The story begins on an afternoon when Edmund and Lucy were stealing a few precious minutes alone together. And of course they were talking about Narnia, which was the name of their own private and secret country. Most of us, I suppose, have a secret country, but for us it's only imaginary country. Edmund and Lucy were far luckier than other people in that respect. Their secret country was real. They had already visited it twice, not in a game or a dream, but in reality. They had gotten there, of course, by magic, which is the only way of getting into Narnia. And a promise, or very nearly a promise, had been made to them in Narnia itself, that they would someday come back. You may imagine that they talked about it a good deal when they got the chance. They were in Lucy's room, sitting on the edge of the bed, looking at a picture on the opposite wall. It was only the picture of a house that they liked. Aunt Alberta didn't like it at all. That's why they put it away in the little back room upstairs, but she couldn't get rid of it because it had been a wedding present from someone that she did not want to offend. It was a picture of a ship sailing, nearing straight towards you. The prow was gliding and shaped like the head of a dragon with a wide open mouth. She had only one mast and one large square sail, which was a rich purple. The sides of the ship, what you could see of them, where the gilded wings of a dragon ended, were green. She had just run up to the top of one glorious blue wave, and the nearer slope of the wave came down towards you, with streaks and bubbles on it. She was obviously running fast before a wind, listing over to a little on her port side. By the way, if you're going to read this story at all, if you don't know already, you'd better get into your head that the left of a ship, and when you are looking ahead, is port, and the right is starboard. All the sunlight fell from that side. The water on that side was full of greens and purples. On the other side, it was darker blue from the shadows of the ship. I'm going to pause again. Hold on. Sorry, guys, I'm being really raspy today. Had to fix that. Okay. Let's see. The question is, said Edmund, whether it doesn't make things worse looking at a Narnia ship when you can't get there. Even looking is better than nothing, said Lucy. And she is such a very Narnian ship. Still playing your old game, said Eustace Clarence, who had been listening outside the door and now came grinning into the room. Last year, when he had been staying with the Pevensies, he had managed to hear them talking of Narnia, and he loved teasing them about it. He thought, of course, that they were making it all up, and he was quite incapable of making anything up himself. He did not approve of that. You're not wanted here, said Edmund curtly. I'm trying to think of a limerick, said Eustace. Something like this. Some kids who played games about Narnia got gradually balmier and balmier. Balmier means crazy. Well, Narnia and balmier don't rhyme to begin with, said Lucy. It's just an assonance, said Eustace. And that means it sounds similar. Okay. Don't ask him what that is, said Edmund. He's only longing to be asked. Say nothing and perhaps he'll go away. Most boys on meeting a reception like this would have either cleared out or flared up. Eustace did neither. He just hung about grinning and presently began talking again. Do you like that picture? He asked. For heaven's sake, don't let him get started about art and all that, said Edmund hurriedly. But Lucy, who was very truthful, had already said, Oh yes, I do. I like it very much. It's a rotten picture, said Eustace. You won't see it if you step outside, said Edmund. Why don't you like it? Why do you like it? Said Eustace to Lucy. Well, for one thing, said Lucy, I like it because the ship looks as if it were really moving. The water looks as if it were really wet. And the waves look as if they're really going up and down. Of course, Eustace knew lots of answers to this, but he didn't say anything. The reason was that at that very moment he looked at the waves and saw that they really did look very much indeed as if they were going up and down. He had only once been on a ship, and then only to the far of the Isle of Wight, and had been horribly seasick. He looked at the waves in the picture, and it made him feel sick again. He turned rather green and tried another look. Then all three children were staring with open mouths. What they were seeing may be hard to believe when you read it in print, but it was almost as hard to believe when you saw it happening. The things in the picture were moving. It didn't look at all like a cinema either. The colors were too real and clean and out of doors for that. Down went the prow of the ship, and up and into the wave, and up went the great shock of spray. And then up went the wave behind her, and the stern and her deck became visible for the first time, and then disappeared as the next wave came down to meet her, and her bow went up again. At the same moment, an exercise book, which had been lying beside Edmund on the bed, flapped, rose, and sailed through the air to the wall behind him, and Lucy felt her hair whipping around her face as it does on a windy day. And this was a windy day, but the wind was blowing out of the picture towards them. Suddenly, with the wind, came a noise, the swishing of the waves and the slap of the water against the ship's sides, the creaking and the overall high and steady roar of the air and water. But it was the smell, the wild, briny smell, which really convinced Lucy that she was not dreaming. Briny means salty. Stop it, came Eustace's voice, squeaky with fright and bad temper. Some silly trick you two are playing. Stop it. I'll tell Alberta. Ow! The other two were much more accustomed to adventures, but just exactly as Eustace Clarence said ow, they both said ow too. The reason was a great cold salt splash had broken right out of the frame, and they were breathless from the smack of it, besides being wet through. I'll smash the rotten thing, cried Eustace, and then several things happened at the same time. Eustace rushed towards the picture. Edmund, who knew something about magic, sprang after him, wanting him to look out and not be a fool. Lucy grabbed at him from the other side and was dragged forward. By the time either they had grown much smaller or the picture had grown bigger, Eustace jumped to try to pull it off the wall and found himself standing on the frame. In front of him was not a glass, but the real sea, the wind and waves rushing up to the frame that they might be to a rock. He lost his head and clutched at the other two who jumped up beside him. There was a second struggling and shouting. Just as though they were getting their balance, a great blue roller surged up around them and swept them off their feet and drew them down into the sea. Eustace's despairing cry suddenly ended as water got into his mouth. Sorry, another pause for a drink. Lucy thanked her stars she had been working hard at her swimming last term. It's true that she would have gotten on much better if she had used a slower stroke, and also that the water felt a great deal colder than it had looked while it was only a picture. Still, she kept her head and kicked her shoes off as everyone ought to do when they fall into deep water in their clothes. She even kept her mouth shut and her eyes open. They were still quite near the ship, and she saw the green side towering high above them. The people looked at her from the deck. Then, as one might have expected, Eustace clutched at her in a panic, and down they both went. They came up again and saw a white figure diving off the ship's side. Edmund was close beside her now, treading water, and had caught the arms of the howling Eustace. Then someone else, whose face was vaguely familiar, slipped an arm under her from the other side. There was a lot of shouting going on from the ship, heads crowded together above the bulwarks, ropes being thrown. Edmund and the stranger were fastening ropes around her, and after that followed what seemed a very long delay, during which her face got blue and her teeth began chattering. In reality, the delay was not very long. They were waiting till the moment when she could be got on board the ship without being dashed against the side. Even with all their best endeavors, she had a bruised knee when she finally stood, dripping and shivering on the deck. After her, Edmund was heaved up, and then the miserable Eustace. Last of all came the stranger, a golden-haired boy, some years older than herself. Caspian, gasped Lucy, as she stood and had breath enough. For Caspian it was. Caspian, the boy king of Narnia, who they had helped set on the throne during their last visit. Immediately Edmund recognized him too. All three shook hands and clapped one another on the back with great delight. But who is your friend? Said Caspian almost at once, turning to Eustace with his cheerful smile. But Eustace was crying much harder than any boy his age had a right to cry when nothing worse than getting a wetting had happened to him, and would only yell out, "Let me go! Let me go back! I don't like it!" "Let you go," said Caspian. "But where?" Eustace rushed to the ship's side, as if he expected to see the picture frame hanging above the sea, and perhaps a glimpse of Lucy's bedroom. But what he saw was blue waves flecked with foam, and paler blue sky, both spreading without a break for the horizon. Perhaps we can hardly blame him if his heart sank. He was promptly sick. "Hey, Rhino," said Caspian to one of the sailors, "bring spiced wine for their majesties. You'll need something to warm you up after that dip." He called Edmund and Lucy majesties because they and Peter and Susan had all been kings and queens in Narnia long before his time. Narnian time flows differently than ours. If you spend 100 years in Narnia, you would still come back to our world at the same hour of the same day on which you left. And then, if you went back to Narnia after spending a week here, you might find that 1,000 Narnian years had passed, or only a day, or no time at all. You never know till you got there. Consequently, when the Pevensey children had returned to Narnia last time on their second visit, it was, for the Narnians, as if King Arthur had come back to Britain, as some people say that he will. And I say, the sooner the better. Sorry, another drink break. You got to remember that C.S. Lewis is a British author, so he writes a lot about England. Rheinelf returned with the spiced wine steaming in a flagon with 4 silver cups. It was just what one wanted, and as Lucy and Edmund sipped it, they could feel the warmth going right down to their toes. But Eustace made faces and spluttered and spat it out and was sick again and began to cry again and asked if they hadn't any Plumtree's vitamized nerve food, and could it be made with distilled water, and anyway he insisted on being put ashore at the very next station. You'd be thinking right now that Eustace really seems like one of those people that don't really want to be around. This is a merry shipmate you've brought with us, brother, whispered Caspian to Edmund with a chuckle. But before he could say anything more, Eustace burst out again. Oh, what on earth is that? Take it away, the horrid thing. He really had some excuse this time for feeling a little surprised. Something very curious indeed had come out of the cabin on the poop deck and was slowly approaching them. You might call it, and indeed it was, a mouse. But then it was a mouse on its hind legs that stood about 2 feet high. A thin band of gold passed around its head under one ear and over the other, and it was stuck in it was a long crimson feather. As the mouse's fur was very dark, almost black, the effect was bold and striking. Its left paw rested on the hilt of a sword, very nearly as long as its tail. Its balance as it paced gravely along the swaying deck was perfect, and its manners courtly. Lucy and Edmund recognized it at once. Reepicheep. I told you he was one of my favorites. The most valiant of all the talking beasts of Narnia, and the chief mouse. It had won undying glory in the second battle of Baruna. Lucy longed, as she had always done, to take Reepicheep up in her arms and cuddle him, but this, as she well knew, was a pleasure she could never have. It would have offended him deeply. Instead, she went down on one knee to talk to him. Reepicheep put forward his left leg, drew back his right, bowed and kissed her hand, straightened himself, twirled his whiskers, and said in a shrill and piping voice, "My humble duty to your majesty, and to King Edmund too," here he bowed again, "nothing except your majesty's presence was lacking to this glorious venture." "Oh, take it away," wailed Eustace. "I hate mice, and I never could bear performing animals. They're silly and vulgar and sentimental." "Am I to understand," said Reepicheep to Lucy after a long stare at Eustace, "that this singularly discourteous person is under your majesty's protection? Because if not—" At this moment Lucy and Edmund both sneezed. "What a fool I am to keep you standing here in your wet things," said Caspian. "Come below and get changed. I'll give you my cabin, of course, Lucy, but I'm afraid we have no women's clothes on board. You'll have to make do with some of mine. Lead the way, Reepicheep, like a good fellow." "To the convenience of a lady," said Reepicheep, "even a question of honor must give way, at least for the moment." And here he looked very hard at Eustace, because Eustace had insulted him and he wanted to challenge him to a duel. But Caspian hustled them on, and in a few minutes Lucy found herself passing through the door into the stern cabin. She fell in love with it at once. The 3 square windows that looked out into the blue swirling waters astern, the low cushioned benches around 3 sides of the table, swinging silver lamp overhead, dwarf's work she knew at once by the exquisite delicacy, the flat gold image of Aslan the lion on the forward wall above the door. All this she took in a flash. For Caspian immediately opened a door on the starboard side and said, "This'll be your room, Lucy. I'll just get some dry things for myself." He was rummaging in one of the lockers while he spoke. "And then I'll leave you to change. If you'll fling your wet things outside the door, I'll get them taken to the galley to be dried." Lucy found herself as much at home as she had been in Caspian's cabin for weeks, and the motion of the ship did not worry her, for in the old days when she had been a queen in Narnia, she'd done a good deal of voyaging. The cabin was very tiny, but bright with painted panels, all birds and beasts and crimson dragons and vines and spotlessly clean. Caspian's clothes were too big for her, but she could manage. His shoes, sandals, and sea boots were hopelessly large, but she did not mind going barefoot on board ship. When she had finished dressing, she looked out of her window at the water rushing past and took a long, deep breath. She felt quite sure that they were in for a lovely time. And that's the end of chapter 1. We'll pick up chapter 2 tomorrow. I hope you enjoy it. Love you guys.